The following episode covers the criminal life and death of Huero Buff from the Hawaiian Gardens gang in Los Angeles. On June 8, 1991, Luis Huero Buff Flores, age 50, the founding father of the Mexican Mafia, passed away in Los Angeles one day after he was released on parole from Pelican Bay State Prison. Huero Buff was raised in the Hawaiian Gardens neighborhood of Southeast Los Angeles. His criminal career began at the age of 13 as he engaged in petty crime and narcotics possession as a youngster. At 17, he was committed to the California Youth Authority, where he teamed up at the Dual Vocational Institution in Tracy, also known as DVI, with fellow Hawaiian Garden street gang confederate Alejandro Hondo Lechuga. The two would become welded at the hip for well over 30 years. While at DVI, the initial idea of a unique ethnic prison gang was conceived by Huero Buff. Like most street youngsters fascinated with traditional organized crime, the Italian mob was viewed by the criminal culture as the street standard for gangsters in the United States. Urban Chicano gang members from the streets of LA were no different. In direct emulation of the East Coast paisanos, Huero Buff came up with the name Mexican Mafia, or La Mafia Mexicana in Spanish. By inviting the leaders of many Los Angeles street gangs into this exclusive fraternity, the Gang of Gangs was born in 1957 at the DVI Youth Facility. The mission statement was simple. They were a consolidation of imprisoned terrorists who considered themselves the worst of the worst. Their basic goal was to control most of the black market criminal activities behind bars, such as drugs, gambling, inmate prostitution, extortion, and any endeavor that turned an illegal dollar. They would, at minimum, enjoy the creature comforts that prison had to offer while they served their prison numbers. Some of the early MM members from Hawaiian Gardens to join Huero Buff and Hondo included Mike Kudo, also known as Jap Mike, who was the first Japanese American to join a Mexican American prison gang. I first met Hapo, Spanish for Jap, at San Quentin's B-section lockup unit, and I recall shaking my head with amusement at the sight of a Japanese guy speaking with a Mexican accent. Originally from Hawaii, he owned a martial arts business and would later operate with fellow MM members who smuggled heroin and meth in large quantities into Hawaii. Howard Cappy Pacini and Danny Chapa were also recruited into the Mexican Mafia and represented their Hawaiian Garden street gang. The proliferation of Mexican Mafia influence began to manifest itself throughout the California prison system, especially at Folsom Prison, which became like a final reunion site for the older seasoned M. Carnales who were creating problems in other CDC facilities. Following his release on parole in 1971, Huero Buff established an immediate heroin smuggling route with fellow homeboy, Emmett brother, and fugitive Hondo Lechuga. With absolutely no intention of adhering to state parole, Hondo walked away from the Folsom Ranch in 1969 and crossed the El Paso border into Juarez, Mexico, where he set up shop with his Mexican drug contacts south of the border. Utilizing street gang members from Hawaiian Gardens and Artesia, Huero Buff and Hondo became the first Mexican Mafia members to employ street operatives in Los Angeles for La M. Like many Mexican Mafia members, Huero Buff was what we referred to as a hope-to-die tecato, or heroin addict, whose personal drug usage kept him in and out of prison for the next 20 years of his life. Huero Buff enjoyed the financial ability to appreciate his wife and kids, owned a comfortable home, and supported a guerrilla of a heroin habit. Although he developed an exceptionally high tolerance for heroin, Huero Buff overdosed several times and managed to successfully elude death each time. When you're young and dumb, no criminal really gives serious thought to the future pitfalls of abusing your body and filling it with poison. Drug-related deaths, whether they be overdoses, liver cancer, Hep C, or other connected related diseases, would become the number one cause of Mexican Mafia-related deaths in their history. That and internal executions. To this very day, like Huero Buff, many M. Carnales give little or no thought to polluting their bodies with the dragon, the name we affectionately gave to heroin. When I paroled from San Quentin in 1975, it was Huero Buff and Joe Morgan who were actively spearheading the drug action on the streets of LA. Although the vast majority of us were concentrated in Southern California, many of the members were located in areas north of Bakersfield, San Francisco, Hayward, Fresno, Sanger, Visalia, and Modesto. Heroin was our number one source of criminal income. As I stated previously, it was also our number one nemesis and destroyer. One of the most popular M members in my lifetime, Gabriel Little Sluggo Castañeda from Eloyo Maravilla, died of an accidental overdose in 1975 inside my Los Angeles home. Then, in 1976, while I was in custody fighting 2 murder charges in Bakersfield, the grapevine conveyed the news of yet another overdose death of a popular brother. Jesse Chewy Frajo from Norwalk, a fellow M member, had injected more than he could handle and died in San Francisco. His well-attended funeral is shown in this photograph. When the 2 murder charges were subsequently dismissed against me in 1977, I attended the baptism of Manuel Tati Torres' son Jacinto in Visalia, California. Huero Buff and several other M. Carnales shown in this photograph were also in attendance to honor Tati's newborn son. Huero Buff drove his motorhome up from LA, and we actively discussed Mexican Mafia business after the blessed event. Reflecting back, I am amazed at the dichotomy of our everyday lives and the extreme opposites of activity. For example, first, we are chosen to be the honorary godfathers to Tati's son, going through all the church rituals, Our Fathers, and Hail Marys full of grace. Then, we separated from the women and children, locked ourselves into Huero Buff's Winnebago to discuss with little to no emotion the people we would have to kill. The simplicity of planning the murders of our targets was easier than, say, filling a shopping list for our women. This was familiar territory for men like Huero Buff and the rest of us. This is what we did for a living. We sent people to Brazil, an expression we coined with fondness in prison. We were cold-blooded killers with zero conscience. For the next 14 years, Huero Buff was considered one of the most respected members of the Mexican Mafia, and rightfully so. The M was his creation, his baby, so to speak. On June 7, 1991, he was released from Pelican Bay. Because he knew he would have to report to his parole officer and submit to a mandatory drug test, he knew he had to abstain from using heroin. Instead, Huero Buff proceeded to celebrate his newly gained freedom by substituting alcohol, the legal and approved high. In an ironic development, Huero Buff, who spent over half of his life addicted to heroin and escaped death from overdose several times, lost his life on June 8, 1991, one day after paroling from prison, after consuming an enormous amount of tequila. It was determined he had drank over 20 shots in a period of 5 hours, with his blood alcohol level measuring over 0.50 at the time of his death. Straddled with his own frailties, heroin addiction, and bad decisions, Huero Buff not only talked the talk, but also walked the walk as an emero, a Mexican Mafia member. When one of his family members had ran afoul of the M, he did not seek special treatment for him nor personal retaliation. He believed a carnal was always right, even when he was wrong, and that the M came first. It would be fair to state, for better or for worse, that Huero Buff lived and died by the code he helped create. May the Lord have mercy on Huero Buff's soul.